I recently came across an article called The Rule of Age 10. The idea was that if you think back to what you loved when you were 10 years old, it can tell you something about who you are. Maybe you loved drawing. Maybe you loved riding your bike. Maybe you loved books, music, animals, or playing outside with your friends. And I sat there thinking, what did I enjoy when I was 10? And honestly, I couldn't think of anything. Not one thing came to my mind immediately. And then I realized why. For me, that was 1984. And 1984 was probably the hardest year of my childhood, and possibly the hardest year of my entire life. My family had moved away from Utah to Missouri, and I hated it. I missed my grandparents. I missed my friends. I missed the only place that had felt like home. And I was only 10 years old. I didn't understand why my life had suddenly changed so dramatically. I just knew that everything familiar was gone. There was a lot of yelling and anger in my home. And at the same time, my parents' marriage was at its worst points. A lot of yelling, a lot of fighting. I remember my dad throwing something across the room and breaking a lamp that had been in our family for years. I remember my mom yelling back at him. And I remember being a child in the middle of it all. There were times when my younger siblings and I were left alone at night, late, sometimes until 10 or 11, sometimes even 12 o'clock midnight. And I was scared, but being scared didn't change anything. We were still alone, and I was still 10. I was also dealing with things at school. I was bullied. Kids made fun of my clothes. They made fun of how I looked. And because I was a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they asked me questions about my religion that I didn't know how to answer. Why don't you drink tea? How come Mormons can't get divorced? And I remember thinking, my aunt is divorced. What are they talking about? I didn't know what to say. I was only 10 years old. I wasn't prepared to defend my beliefs to anybody. I was just trying to fit in. And then there was the house that we lived in. Oh, it was probably the worst house I have ever lived in. There were bugs, fleas, spiders, mice, squirrels. The bathroom had problems. The toilet broke. Sometimes we had to use the neighbor's bathroom or use the porta potty outside. There were times when it was so cold that I would lie in bed during the day just to stay warm. And there were mice everywhere. They got into our food. They got into our drawers. They got into our closets. I remember seeing evidence of them in places where children were supposed to be sleeping and living. And somehow, this was just our normal life. I don't remember thinking, this is traumatic. I was 10. I just thought, this is my life. There was also a lot of poverty. I was going through a growth spurt, and I didn't have enough clothes that fit. I remember wearing a jacket much of the year because I didn't have enough warm clothing. I remember being embarrassed about what I wore. I remember worrying about food. Breakfast was often oatmeal. Lunch was usually whatever cheap food we had. Dinner might be biscuits or toast. And I remember being aware of money in a way that a child shouldn't have to be. I knew we didn't have much. And I worried about it a lot. But here's the thing that really struck me when I thought about that article. They weren't asking me anything about that. They were asking, what did you enjoy when you were 10? And I couldn't think of anything. I couldn't remember a favorite hobby, a favorite activity. I couldn't remember some wonderful childhood summer. What I remembered was being afraid, being embarrassed, being cold, being hungry, being homesick, being yelled at, trying not to make anybody angry, trying to take care of my younger siblings, trying to understand a world that had suddenly become very different. And I think there's something important about that. Sometimes when we talk about childhood, we assume children will remember the good things, the birthday parties, the vacations, the games, the friends, the little things that made them happy. But what happens when your childhood was mostly about surviving? What happens when you're so busy trying to figure out whether the adults around you are going to be okay, that you don't have much room left to simply be a child? Maybe that's why I couldn't answer the question. Maybe I didn't lose those happy memories. Maybe there just weren't very many of them. And I'm not telling you that because I want you to feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because I'm finally old enough to look back at that 10-year-old girl and understand something I couldn't understand then. She was doing the best she could. She wasn't weak. She was not overly sensitive. She wasn't bad. She was 10 years old. And she was living through circumstances that were too big for her. And maybe that's what happens when we look back at our childhood with adult eyes. We finally realize that some of the things we thought were normal weren't normal at all. And some of the things we blamed ourselves for that were never ours to carry. So I still don't know exactly what I enjoyed when I was 10. But I think I'm beginning to understand what I needed. I needed safety and stability. I needed adults who could handle their own anger. I needed someone to notice when I was scared. I needed someone to tell me, you don't have to worry about this. You're a child. Let the adults take care of it. And maybe that's what I wish I could go back and tell that little girl right now. You don't have to figure everything out. You don't have to fix everything. You don't have to keep everyone happy. You don't have to carry everyone else's problems. You're 10 years old. You're allowed to be a child. But there's something else I've realized. Maybe this isn't only a story about the little girl I was. Maybe it's also about the adults we become. Because maybe you're watching this and you can't remember what you loved when you were 10 years old either. Maybe when you think about childhood, you don't immediately remember your favorite toy or your favorite game or some carefree summer afternoon. Maybe what you remember is being afraid. Maybe you remember trying to keep everybody happy. Maybe you remember listening for footsteps. Maybe you remember watching the adults around you and trying to figure out what kind of mood they were in. Maybe you remember taking care of things that weren't supposed to be your responsibility. And maybe you've spent your whole adult life wondering why certain things still affect you, why you're always worried about making people angry, Why you have such a hard time relaxing. Why you feel responsible for everybody else's emotions. Why you're having trouble asking for what you need. Why you always feel like you have to be strong. If that's you, I want to tell you something that I wish I had understood sooner. You weren't a difficult child. You weren't too sensitive. You weren't weak. You weren't failing. You were adapting to the world you were given. You were trying to make sense of the things that a child shouldn't have to make sense of. And maybe you don't have to spend the rest of your life blaming that child for the ways that she learned how to survive. Maybe you can look back at that younger version of yourself with a little more compassion. Maybe you can finally say, you did the best you could. It wasn't your job to fix everything. It wasn't your job to keep everyone happy. You were a child. And maybe now, as an adult, you get to give yourself some of the things that little child didn't have, like safety and rest, stability and compassion, and permission to stop carrying what was never yours. I can't go back to 1984 and change it. I can't give that little girl a different childhood. I can't erase the things that happened. But I can change the way I look at her. And maybe that's one of the gifts of getting older. We finally become old enough to understand the child we once were. And instead of asking, why wasn't she stronger? We can finally ask, why did she have to be so strong in the first place? So no, I still can't tell you what my favorite thing was when I was 10. But I know something about that girl now that I didn't know then. She deserved to be safe, to feel safe. She deserved to play. She deserved to laugh. She deserved to have her favorite things. She deserved to be a child. And maybe you deserve those things too. Maybe you don't need to forget your childhood to move forward. Maybe you don't even need to make it sound better than it was. Maybe sometimes healing begins with simply telling the truth. That was hard. I was a child. It wasn't my fault. And I don't have to carry it the same way anymore. I can't give my 10-year-old self those years back, but I can give her something now. I can give her compassion. I can stop blaming her. I can stop expecting her to have known things that no 10-year-old could have known. And I can finally tell her, you didn't fail. You weren't the problem. You were a little girl trying to survive. And maybe that's what I remember most about being 10. Not what I loved, and not what I played with, not what I did for fun, but the little girl who was there, quietly trying to survive. And after all these years, I don't want to ask her anymore, why couldn't you just be happier? I want to tell her, I'm sorry you had to grow up so fast. I'm proud of you for making it through. And you don't have to be that strong anymore. And maybe, if you're watching this, and you recognize yourself in that little girl, you don't have to be that strong anymore. You had to be strong because you were a child in circumstances that required it. But now you're an adult. You can let some things be somebody else's responsibility. You can rest. You can ask for help. You can say no. You can take care of yourself too. Thanks for spending time with me today. Like, subscribe, and share, and I'll see you next time.